So can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I've written a 2-volume book on the business cycle titled Money, Banking, and the Business Cycle, and it was published by Palgrave Macmillan. And the book explains the business cycle based on Austrian business cycle theory, as developed by the economist Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist, and George Reisman. And Austrian economics is a school of economic thought that originated in Austria in the 19th century. And Austrian business cycle theory in particular provides a comprehensive explanation of the business cycle. It explains the facts of the cycle in a logically consistent manner. And today, as the title of my talk states, I'm going to use Austrian cycle theory to explain the recession of the early 1980s in the US, and also relate it to what's happening today to some extent in the US. And this is something I may also be able to turn into a paper at some point. But before I get into the explanation of the early 80s recession in the US based on Austrian cycle theory, let me give a very brief explanation or description of Austrian cycle theory that'll help to set the context for the explanation. So Austrian cycle theory says that the expansion phase or the boom phase of the business cycle occurs when government policy leads to accelerating increases in the supply of money and credit, and thus temporarily reduces interest rates and increases spending in the economy and revenues for businesses and profits as well, and the rate of profit the businesses can earn in the economy. And when these changes take place unexpectedly, especially, businesses expand their activities and produce more in an attempt to take advantage of the artificially high profits and low interest rates. They can make more money, and the low interest rates enable them to borrow money at a lower cost to expand their business. The contraction phase of the cycle ensues when government policy leads to decreases in the supply of money and credit, the amount of lending that's going on, or just merely insufficient increases in these variables. And during the contraction or the bust phase of the cycle, spending and revenues and profits fall or fail to rise sufficiently, especially relative to expectations, and interest rates rise as well, especially again relative to expectations, due to the decrease or insufficient increase in the supply of credit. So the conditions become such that it's less profitable to do business or expand your business. And a part of the changes taking place during the business cycle, according to Austrian cycle theory, include what are known as changes in the structure of production. And what that means is that industries farther removed from final consumption, or that are more interest rate more sensitive to changes in interest rates, they tend to expand and contract more. So for instance, capital goods industries will tend to expand and contract more relative to consumers goods industries. You can think of manufacturing farther back in the production chain. Those industries tend to expand and contract more than, say, retail industries. And so how does this all apply to the early 80s recession in the US? And let's see, I have some charts here now, some graphs that I want to focus on that help to explain what's happening. So this first graph here focuses on real GDP, real gross domestic product. This is gross domestic product. GDP is a common measure of spending in the economy that's used to measure spending in the US and throughout the world, throughout countries in the world. But this is real GDP. So it's an attempt to measure output, what's produced, the goods and services produced, and it's in billions of 2005 dollars from 1975 to 1985. And what you can see here is that you get an increase. What's happening is real GDP output is increasing during the latter 70s in the US. That was the expansion in the latter 70s. We actually in the US had a recession in 75. You can't see it because I don't show real GDP in 74. But then you see this flat period from 79 to 82, and there are a couple of downturns in 80 and then 82, and it goes up a little bit in 81. But that flat portion with a couple of downturns, so that's the recession of the early 80s. Then it expands again as you move into the past that recession. And And this is one view of what the recession looked like in the US. It's not a very good view, because ultimately GDP, we'll see, is not a good measure of spending. We get a better picture of what's going on in the early 80s and surrounding time periods with this variable called real GNR, or gross national revenue. And so gross national revenue is a measure of spending, and I'll talk about how it's a much more comprehensive measure of spending. It expanded dramatically at about, let's see, it expanded at about 5.5% during the latter 70s. It expanded after the recession at about 3%. But you see the downturn from 79 to 82 is much more dramatic. Real GNR declined by about 5% during that period, with 3 years going down, and then the fourth year, 1983, wasn't a very big uptick. And this is true of real GDP versus real GNR. GDP tends to show smaller fluctuations. Real GDP does, and GDP, because GDP, it's not a comprehensive measure of spending. And so real GDP is not a comprehensive measure of output. GDP only includes spending on what are known as final goods and services in the hands of the final users. It doesn't include gross spending by businesses for inventory, so it misses the more significant parts of the fluctuations. GNR is a comprehensive measure of spending. It was developed by one of those economists, George Reisman, and it includes all spending by businesses, including gross spending by businesses for inventory. And inventory meaning goods that businesses are purchasing to resell. And because GNR includes all spending by businesses on newly produced goods and services, it fluctuates more than GDP. And this is really due to the compounding effect of changing interest rates on industries farther removed from final consumption. And like I said, consumers goods industries tend to fluctuate less overall than capital goods industries as a result. And that's consistent with Austrian business cycle theory, that changes in interest rates cause changes in the structure of production, changes in the mix of the relative sizes of industries. So where the capital goods. What's that?
3 minutes left.
3 minutes? Okay, thanks. And where capital goods industries expand and contract more relative to consumers goods industries. And there's a lot more I could say about the effects. These are the effects of the business cycle, but obviously for time, I want to get into the causes, and briefly, I want to focus on the proximate causes of the early 80s recession and recessions in general, according to Austrian cycle theory. And that's the rate of interest and the rate of profit. So the dashed line with the triangles is interest. It's a short-term interest rate, the 6-month commercial paper rate, and the rate of profit is the return on equity. And these follow the typical pattern. It rises during the interest rate rises, is fairly low, and starts to rise as you head toward the recession. It's high during the recession, then falls. The rate of profit is high during expansions, such as the latter 70s. It falls then prior to or during the recession, providing less of an incentive to expand, and then begins to rise. What I want to focus on more so, though, is the rate of change in the money supply, because that's the fundamental economic driver of the business cycle. And what I want to focus on here is, you can see, coming out of the recession I mentioned in 75, the money supply was expanding at a rapid rate, and this isn't the amount of money, the dollar amount of money, it's the rate of change. So the percent rate of change from year to year. It's the M1 money supply, which was a good measure of the money supply back then. So it increased, creating that expansion. But then you notice there are 4 years when the rate of increase decreased. And there was a concerted effort on the part of the Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, at the time, the Federal Reserve being the central bank in the US. He wanted to reduce the rate of increase in the money supply and reduce prices, prevent them from increasing so fast, because they were increasing quickly. And that concerted effort that he announced to the world really induced that recession in the early 80s, similar to what's going on today, except much more significant back then than now. the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, he's making a concerted effort to reduce the rate of increase in prices and reduce the rate of increase in the money supply. And it's having a similar effect, although interest rates today are maybe around short-term rates are maybe 5% in the US or 4%, whereas back in the early 80s, they went up to about 15 or 16%. So there was a much more serious action then, and it induced a significant recession at that time. So that's really the fundamental causal factor here with regard to business. What's that?
Less than 1 minute.
Less than 1 minute. Okay. Well, the changes in the money supply are really the driver and fundamental economic driver of the business cycle. And this significant 4-year decline in the rate of increase is what really drove it. I have some other charts on the money supply. That rate of decrease in the increase took place within a significant inflation over a 25-year period or so, from the 60s to the 80s in the US. You can see the money supply going up in this chart at higher percentages, and prices, at least through 1980, going up at higher percentages. That's what these columns represent. I could say more about what's known as the velocity of circulation money, but I don't think I really have time. So you can also see some of my references here that I used. But I'll end it there. And if anybody has any questions, I will be glad to entertain them.
Thank you.